All right, hello folks. It is time for Friday Fromage from the Farm once again. So I am your host, Kate Johnson. I'm just messing with some of the lighting here. And I'm with the Art of Cheese in Longmont, Colorado. And that is a cheese making school that is now all virtual. I am coming to you from my classroom, but I'm the only one in my classroom because it's kind of small and it's very hard for us to social distance. So all of our classes are now being done virtually via Zoom. So I'm going to teach you some things today for free. And then if you want to learn a little more detail, come join us sometime at one of our classes at theartofcheese.com. So every Friday I come to you and we talk about cheese from the farm because my classroom is located on my working dairy goat farm. So I do tend to talk a lot about goats and I do tend to talk a lot about goat cheeses, but I do teach all types of cheeses from all types of milk. But because tomorrow is National Wine and Cheese Day, did you know that? I decided we should talk about wine and cheese today. But more appropriately, we're going to talk about wine in cheese. Or if you really want to get specific, we're going to talk about wine on cheese. So what we're going to talk about today is drunken goat cheese. So this is a wine-soaked goat cheese. And so it's very white, which is very classic with goat cheeses because goat milk is very white because goats can fully metabolize beta-carotene. And so they take the orange out for you and put it into vitamin A instead. At any rate, this is a very nice semi-hard cheese. It is pressed and aged, and it has a beautiful purple rind, and that is wine. So we're going to talk a little bit about this cheese for a few minutes, but then I'm going to kind of launch into a discussion about ways that we can categorize cheeses, because there's a lot of ways we could categorize this particular cheese. And I guess it's the teacher in me. I love to categorize things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about different ways we can talk about cheeses and why we might talk about them one way or another in certain settings. But to start with, this particular drunken goat cheese, I often do like to talk about small creameries or artisan creameries that are making cheeses. This particular one's not from somewhere so small, although the cheese itself may have been made on a small farm. But I bought this at Murray's cheese counter, and this came from Mitica. Mitica is one of the largest importers of gourmet cheeses in the U.S., and they are exclusively represented by Forever Cheese in Long Island, New York. So, you know, I don't really know exactly where this cheese was made, other than to say it was made in Spain, because drunken goat cheese is often referred to as cabra al vino, which basically means goats in wine. Okay, and so it is a Spanish cheese, although there are different varieties that may not be Spanish. And in fact, that lends us well to talking about one of the ways we can categorize cheeses, right? A lot of times when you're buying cheeses or talking about the cheeses you like, you might talk about what country they came from. So you might talk about French cheeses or Italian cheeses or Spanish cheeses. But from a cheese making perspective, that doesn't actually tell you all that much about how that cheese was made, but more so really where that cheese originally was developed. Because of course, I'm making drunken goat cheese and I'm in the USA in Colorado. So, you know, that doesn't tell me too much about how the cheese is made, but it does tell me where it originated. But it is one way to categorize cheeses when you're talking about tastes you like and styles of cheese, although many countries are making many styles of cheese now. So another way that we could talk about cheeses is in terms of how long it is until you can eat the cheese. So two very broad categories of cheeses are fresh cheeses versus aged cheeses. So a fresh cheese you would make and eat pretty close to the same day. Sometimes within hours, sometimes it might be, well, sometimes it might be in 15 minutes. You can make ricotta in about 15 minutes. But sometimes it might be a cheese that takes 24 hours or maybe even a couple of days, but we would still probably categorize it as a fresh cheese. Whereas an aged cheese, we might make the cheese, or at least do the make, and the make is the term that we refer to when we're talking about the day we work with the milk. We might do that today, and we might not eat that cheese for weeks, months, or years, right? And so that period of time while that cheese is aging is often referred to as the affinage. And there are affineurs. I'm probably not saying that right, but it's a French term for aging your cheeses. And there are some people, that's their entire job, is the aging part of the cheese. So that's another way we can categorize cheeses. Of course, another way we could do it is by what species the milk came from. So of course, there are goat cheeses, right? A lot of people will say to me, oh, I love or I hate goat cheese. And I'll often say, well, which one? Because to me, goat cheese could be anything. Because I think a lot of people are thinking Chev, you know, that classic soft goat cheese. But any cheese could be made from goat milk. And of course, Drunken goat cheese is a goat cheese. But I make goat cheddar and goat Swiss and goat blues and goat washed rinds. You get the picture. I've got goat milk. So if you give me a cheese recipe, I am going to be using goat milk for my own personal cheese making. Now, I will teach you how to make that cheese out of whatever milk you can get your hands on. And there are different qualities of milk, but we can make cheese out of just about any milk. Maybe not great cheese, but pretty good cheese, even out of grocery store milk. You can't make it out of ultra pasteurized milk, though, so don't try that. All right, so there's another way to categorize cheese, is what animal gave you the milk. I know there are vegan cheeses too, but folks, those aren't cheese, okay? I mean, I love my vegan friends, but those aren't cheese. Those are imitating cheese, because cheese by definition is a dairy product, all right? So let's just get that clear. All right, so another way we could categorize cheese has to do with some of the ingredients that are used to make that milk solid, all right? So there's often two steps to making your milk solid. The first step might be to acidify it, and we usually do that with culture. And then the second step would be to coagulate it. And we usually do that with rennet, which is an enzyme. But there are some cheeses that it's a one-step thing. You acidify and coagulate it at the same time. And that's where you're adding an acid to hot milk. So think of ricotta and paneer and mascarpone. These are all direct acidification, high heat cheeses. So they don't use culture and rennet. They just use an acid, something like tartaric acid or citric acid or lemon juice or vinegar. Okay, so that's one class of cheeses, direct acidification cheeses. And then there are cultured cheeses, and those can be broken into different classifications. There might be lactic set cheese, which would have very little, if any, rennet, but a long coagulation time. And then there are cheeses that we would refer to as fully renneted cheeses. And those are ones that would have more rennet with a shorter coagulation time. So now we're starting to get into the lingo that cheese makers use. And most of us who are just out there buying cheese don't know anything about these products or about these techniques. Then there's a whole host of other techniques that are used in cheese making. And those become really these variables that us cheesemakers are talking about. And sometimes a cheese fits in several different categories. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We might talk about a cheese in terms of the rind, okay? What's on the outer edge of a wheel of cheese? Now, a cheese like Chev or ricotta obviously has no rind because it's not a wheel of cheese. But when you make a wheel of cheese, which involves pressing that cheese in some kind of a form, you may or may not have a rind. So a cheese that is waxed won't develop a rind at all. And that might be called a rindless cheese. Sometimes we're using vacuum sealing machines in order to make a rindless cheese. Excuse me. Then we might have a rind made out of wine, a wine-soaked cheese. So this rind is literally made from soaking the cheese in wine and then drying it a bit, and that wine stays on the rind. Okay, we could do that with whiskey or beer or all kinds of things. And then there's a rind that's just mold, okay? There's lots of different moldy rinds. So there's a natural rind, and those are just the naturally occurring molds that appear in that cheese because of either the milk that you used or the environment where you're making that cheese. Which is why if I made cheese at my house and you made cheese at your house and we followed the exact same recipes and the exact same milk, but we were doing something like a natural rind, they might turn out to be pretty different cheeses because I have different microflora in my area than you do. And then consider, the Mediterranean versus the Alps. So this is how we can get a lot of different flavor profiles just from where that cheese is made. Think of San Francisco sourdough bread, right? You can make sourdough anywhere, but you can only make San Francisco sourdough in San Francisco, where they have that certain mix of microflora. Another rind might be another mold that we put there intentionally. So think of Brie and Camembert. Those fall in a category of cheeses we call bloomy rind cheeses or surface ripened cheeses. And that rind grows because of something we put there, Penicillium candidum. And then we might also have a rind that we develop as that cheese ages, as in a washed rind cheese. Sometimes we are doing something called washing the rind with maybe a little salt solution, and or maybe we've added some Brevibacterium linens or B linens, which is basically a red mold powder. And that'll make that gooey, stinky rind that a lot of washed rind cheeses has. We might wash the rind with beer or wine in this case. So this one, I actually soak it in the wine, but I also then do wash it in wine a little bit too. So that's one way to talk about cheeses. What kind of rind or lack thereof does that cheese have? Another way might have to do with some of the techniques we use while we're making the cheese and or while we're aging the cheese. So for instance, this cheese does have a rind, so I could listen to all the ways I could categorize this cheese. This cheese is an aged cheese. It's a pressed cheese. It's a goat cheese. It's a wine rind cheese. It is also a washed curd cheese. And what that means is during the make of making a cheese like this is Drunken goat cheese, but it's similar in, let's say, Colby and Havarti and Gouda. These all fall into this category of washed curd cheeses. And it's a process during the making of the cheese where we actually remove some of the liquid, the whey, and replace it with water in order to dilute the acidity that was created by the culture. And so we're washing the curds. And these cheeses typically are mild and very moist, very creamy, because acidity affects flavor and texture, right? So there you go. Another way to categorize your cheese. And many times there's crossovers, right? I probably haven't even hit them all. So this cheese, I would say, is also a washed rind cheese, because when I make Drunken goat, I continue to wash the rind with wine for a little while. You could do it with just a salt solution, but I do it with wine because why not? It's already got wine, right? So those are the many different ways, and they probably aren't even all of them, that we could categorize cheese. Because we could also talk about what we did to the milk, a raw milk cheese versus a pasteurized milk cheese, or which culture we used. Is this one made with mesophilic or thermophilic, or even within those cultures? So, when somebody asks you how many different kinds of cheese are there, it's a really hard question to answer. And I know because I wrote an article one time trying to answer that question. And it just depends on how you want to define types. How many different types? Well, do you want to talk about how many different flavor profiles, or how many different techniques there are, or how many different rinds there are? And really, that is an impossible question to answer, because as soon as you think you've answered it, somebody just invented yet another type of cheese, sometimes on purpose, sometimes quite by accident. And in fact, this takes us back to Drunken goat cheese. There's some funny stories or legends about how this cheese first happened, that somebody was drinking a little too much wine while they were making their cheese, and a wheel of wine fell into the wine, or a wheel of cheese fell into the wine. And a couple days later, they came back and pulled it out and thought, oh, I just made a new cheese. So there are many cheeses that have great little backstories like that, whether they're true or not, I don't know. But that's my little story today about drunken goat cheese. Now, if you would like to learn how to make drunken goat cheese, or if you just want to make a drunken cow cheese, which I call tipsy cow, you know, it's a little, I guess, a little nod to cow tipping. And, you know, because you could make this cheese from cow milk, it's just then you can't call it cabra al vino, or you can't call it drunken goat, but then you could call it tipsy cow. If you want to learn how to do that, on August 8th, I have a class. So it's up on my website, and we are going to learn all of the steps involved in making this drunken goat cheese. And in fact, this is my little drunken goat cheese that is now aging. I get to a point where I'm done fighting the mold, and I just vacuum seal it. So I do wash that rind with wine for a while, but eventually the mold tends to want to take over because this is a very high moisture cheese, and you're just going to get some mold on the rind. And so in order to keep that wine rind, I don't really want moldy wine rind, I eventually do vacuum seal mine, or you could wax them. So at any rate, this is one that I made the videos for my virtual class, which is going to premiere on August 8th. And next week, I'll talk about some other cheeses and some of the classes that are coming up that represent those. But in the meantime, grab some cheese, grab some wine. Doesn't have to be a cheese with wine or with wine on it or in it, but it is Wine and Cheese Day tomorrow. So be sure you have a little wine. And hopefully I'll see you again next week at Friday Fromage from the farm, or at one of my virtual cheese making classes. Or if you want to learn about goats, join me on Monday mornings for Monday Morning from the Milk House at 9 o'clock Mountain Time here on Facebook. I don't do it on the YouTube live yet because I just haven't figured out how to get all my equipment in the Milk House. But I am here on Instagram and Facebook. Instagram is a little bit later, half hour later. All right, so nice to see you all. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you again later. Have a fantastic weekend. All righty, everybody. Bye-bye.